Okay. Well, first off, welcome. I'm Bob Carlton. Joining us today is Lisa Bain Carlton, the founder and CEO and senior consultant at College Matchpoint, and Julie Ritchie on our team, who's an educational consultant on our team. And welcome to maybe our favorite webinar of the year. Don't tell anybody that, but we just love talking with students and parents about this topic, and that is activity planning. It's easy to get focused on college planning and application planning, but we love this topic, and we're excited to spend the next hour with you, sharing with you the how and the why, and even some of the when of activity planning. A couple of housekeeping notes. First off, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar and this presentation, as well as a couple of resources that we're going to mention in a follow-up note tomorrow. Two, if you have questions, please feel free to utilize the Q&A box. It makes it a little easier for us to keep track of questions. If they're super specific, we may not be able to answer them in the time we have today, but generally speaking, we find that the Q&A is super helpful for covering anything that folks may want to have. This webinar is of a series of webinars that we do. Today is really foundational. In November, we'll drill down very specifically to the University of Texas at Austin, which is of interest to a lot of students, not just in Texas, but across the country. We'll talk about activity planning for the summer. In February, we'll talk about college tours. A lot of juniors are focused about that with their parents. And then finally, in March, we'll talk highly selective colleges and particularly some numbers around highly selective colleges. In terms of an agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about what engagement looks like during high school. We'll talk about where should it start? What do colleges consider, and specifically, what does University of Texas at Austin consider? And then, because most of the folks on this webinar are parents, we'll talk about the role, the important role that parents can play. So, why is engagement in activities so important for high school students, from frankly 8th grade through graduating high school? Why is it so important? Well, we've found in our 15 years of working with students that engaging in activities is key to thriving in college. And in fact, the lessons learned, the skills developed, the knowledge, the sense of belonging that students get by being engaged, both in the classroom and out of the classroom, are the springboard to a student thriving in the college that they select. Now, that's not just our opinion. Gallup is an organization that does a tremendous amount of research around high school students, and what thriving means. Students who are engaged in activities are 2.5 times more likely to say they excel in school, and they're 4.5 times more likely to be hopeful about the future. Students really are eager to dig in, even when they don't know what that means. And that digging in, that becoming more engaged, is really powerful for their experience in high school and for their hope about what comes after high school. Now, as I said, Gallup has done some phenomenal research, and one of the things that they pointed out in a study just released is how much students, these high school students, are struggling to thrive. Less than half feel like they're thriving, the lowest across several generations. Gallup has been doing this study all the way through back to the silent generation, and they found that this group of students is struggling almost as much as any generation and as much as that generation. Over 3/4 of those students feel like they have a great future, but under half feel prepared. Now, one of the reasons that we're excited to talk with all of you is because the research also found that having encouraging adults in your life is one of the biggest drivers of feeling possible and positive about future goals. And then the final thing is we'll talk a lot about extracurriculars here, but there's also a sense that coming out of the pandemic, these kids who went through middle school or early high school, they really both have a learning loss, but an extracurricular loss, a social loss. Now, one of the things that we do want to point out is how much this generation continues to struggle with mental health. Their sense of their own personal health is the lowest in generations. The Surgeon General earlier in this year talked about the sort of epidemic of teenage mental health. Only 15% of teenagers say that they feel like their mental health is excellent, compared to 50% of millennials. And young women particularly are struggling, much more so than young men, particularly when it comes to stress and anxiety. And we know when we talk about engagement, when we talk about extracurriculars, that it really is ignoring a key issue if we don't stay grounded in the fact that so many of these students are struggling with their own mental health. Now, as I know before, students do see hope for their future. They believe they'll achieve the goals. They feel like they have a great future in front of them. And for many of those students, that sense of hope for the future is around their dream job. But one of the reasons today that we're going to talk about activities and how students can become more engaged is because only 44% of high school students report that they feel prepared for the future. And that gap isn't just bridged in the classroom, that gap is also bridged in the extracurriculars that they get engaged in based on their talents and their motivators. Now, it's oftentimes sort of esoteric to think about what does it mean for a high school student to thrive in high school. And oddly enough, I want to give you just half a minute to scan this. In their research with students, Gallup summarized these 5 points as sort of the functional definition of what it means to a high school student to thrive. They get to use their skills, their strengths, their talents on a daily basis. Their activities push them in a positive way. That they've heard positive feedback on a project or an assignment in the past week. And in the past week, they've learned new skills that help them grow and prepare for the future. And then finally, that they've recently learned something interesting that expanded their knowledge or taught them skills. Now, I know for the adults on this, you probably can think back to your own high school experience and thought about experiences that you had. Heck, I know as an adult, this is a great definition for me of what it means to thrive. And in today's webinar, what we want to try to do is build on this, is talk about the why and the how of activity planning as it relates to how students can thrive in high school. And one of the foundational pieces of that is this idea of growth mindset, something that Carol Dweck at Stanford School of Education came up with over a decade ago. Fixed mindset is something that is tempting not to get pulled into during high school, particularly when that fixed mindset is getting into a specific college. That is the definition of a fixed mindset. And what Carol Dweck encourages us to think about is a growth mindset. that student can learn to do anything, but they might have failures along the way. They're going to try new things. Feedback is constructive. Carol Dweck talks about the positive impact of yet, that a student hasn't learned to do something yet, that they haven't developed those skills yet. And so we encourage particularly parents to really think about the impact you can have with your child coming from a sense of growth mindset. And when we partner with parents, we see the powerful impact of them approaching particularly the high school years with a growth mindset. Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about how that activity planning really can help drive a sense of how a student thrives?
Absolutely. I think what we're really there's like a little bit of tension in, kind of what Bob said. On the one hand, we're looking at how do we encourage students to and give them the positive that they need and balance that with challenge. And I think that's what we're hoping for here because that's what helps students feel proud, feel like they're thriving, feel like they're growing. So I think that getting out of that fixed mindset of, okay, if a student fails, rather than running in and saving them from it, letting them have that experience, but also encouraging them that you're okay and challenging them to jump back in. I think some of us in our generation of parenting, that has been harder for us to learn to do. And I think that's what, if we're looking at the research, what the kids need is, on one hand, this very encouraging adult who's going to be with them. And on the other hand, a real steady sense of challenge so that they can feel proud of what they're doing and what they're accomplishing. And they can grow and they can learn agency in their own lives to then be able to say, yeah, I think I like this. I don't like that. And be able to explore, because that's when the wave begins, is when we can, the wave can't begin until we get them in the ocean, right? And I think one of the things we see with the crop of kids right now is they're hesitant to kind of put their foot in the water, right? So we have to help them there. And I think this is also where sometimes, sometimes for younger kids especially, doing this as a family can be helpful. So we're going to talk a little bit about the model of activity planning that we use, keeping this context of what we know about kids and engagement. Bob and I were so excited about this research because it really is a critical overlay to anything else that we talk about. And so I don't know how many years ago, kind of Bob and I came up with this, which is, there's nothing incredibly unique about it, but a little model to think about kids and engagement. And the first thing is like, what energizes you? What's exciting to you? What do you actually would you like to try, right? And I think as adults in kids' lives, that's the place we want to start. We're all on this screen, parents. So we know that we've all fallen into what you really ought to do is X. But the more we can try to pull out from kids what interests them and then help them get involved where they're actually energized, that's going to help them. And then as they get older and they get more into the ocean, if you will, then we think about where might they begin to now have enough confidence to have initiative, to think about how they're going to actually make a difference. But we first have to start with what actually energizes them.
One of the things that's exciting for us is when we get a chance to talk, maybe it's an eighth or ninth grader, it could be a junior in high school, and we really step back from this sense of fixed mindset. Where am I going to go to college? And we meet them on what interests them. It might be a student who loves volleyball, hasn't made the varsity team yet, but loves being the manager of their team. It might be that student who loves a specific specific type of art. Might be that student who's built Minecraft modifications or done things in Roblox. But where are you interested? And we always oftentimes hear students say, well, I don't know if this counts. Like, I don't know if this is important. And what's important is what energizes them, that spark that they see and that we're lucky enough to see with students.
And I would say just today, I was on with a student. We were working on finishing his application, and and he lets out something he's never let out. He spends 8 hours a week on music because he loves it. And we never knew this about him until today while we're working on his application, when he's like, well, I mean, this is really kind of dumb, but because I was saying, I feel like we're maybe some things we don't have here. And then to hear him talk about it, it was just so lovely. And I had on with me another person on our team who's been in admissions, and she's like, no, I really would have been sad if I hadn't known that and I read your application, because he had actually, none of it was, he didn't have a lot of formal stuff, but he had gone very deep in, and the way he had taught himself all these different songs. So that's where, when we follow students' interests, I think, like Bob said, they often think that really critical things that they're doing don't matter. And that's where I think we'll talk a little later about some of the myths around activities and what actually counts. Now, when we think about 8th through 10th graders, we're not thinking of all high school kids as the same, because they're developmentally in very different phases. Okay. And we see this when we work with kids. So it's really important when we think about 8th through 10th graders to allow for exploration. It's also super helpful when we go back to that stat about, kids ultimately want to know they're going to be successful in a job. We need for them to explore different things before we just say, here, land the plane, right? And so this is the time we want them to explore. When we get to like 11th grade, some students will do this younger and some will do it later, to be honest. We want them to start focusing more in on opportunities that are going to show initiative and impact. But every student's not at the same place. Some kids may have had a really rough 9th and 10th year, and they may start their interest and involvement in the 11th grade. So while this is a framework that we kind of have in our heads, I think we spend more of our time wanting 8th and 10th graders to explore and not focus early, so that they're able to make sure that they're seeing the whole range of things they like. That's part of high school, is to explore. But by that 11th grade year, if we can, we then want them to focus a little more. And that's where they really start to, we'll give a couple of examples today about kids that started with just one activity and where they went. I think that's when they really start to feel like, wow, I went from here to here, or that thing took me all the way around the road and I landed here. And I think it's very exciting for kids. And what we know about learning and just human experience is that when I do that once, I can do that with other things in my life. And that is why this is so tied to ultimately thriving and feelings of thriving. Now, what do you use your guide when you're trying to think about what you might want to get involved in, right? One of the things is to think about the student, right? What are natural gifts and talents? We want to lean into what the student is already innately good at, because that's also where they're likely to feel the most success and energy. And then we want to look at, what are skills that I want to further develop, and I am always surprised by when you ask students that question. It's rare that they can't answer it. They usually have some skill they want to learn. And it can be anywhere from, I want to learn to communicate better, to I want to learn how to take the engine of a car apart, and everything in between, And so that's a great conversation question to be having with students is, how do what would you like to learn? And then what is it that motivates a student? Like, if we're working with a student who we know hates to sit at a desk and whatever, and we say, hey, do you want to or a math competition where you have to sit and do a bunch of problems, probably not motivating, right? So always as we're guiding our students, we want to think about who they are, their unique being and their unique aptitudes. And if we don't, we sort of miss, we're less likely for them to have as much success because we're sort of forgetting the person at the table. So that's very, very important. Bob, you want to add anything there? Yeah.
Yeah, a comment on this. Look, Lisa and I are both parents. Julie is a parent. We know how much we all love to brag on our students' talents and gifts. That's where engagement starts. Not some sense of what it takes to get into this school or what an application means, their own sense of talents and gifts. If you think back to that Gallup research, students are really energized by developing skills. And when those skills are connected to something that they see, particularly about their future, it really builds on itself. As Lisa said, that sort of wave that builds on itself. And then the final thing around motivation, with this cohort of students, it sometimes takes a little searching to find that motivation, to find that sense of, do you do this because you love bringing people together? Do you do this because you're competitive? Do you do this because honestly, you like hands-on projects? And again, the comment I'd love to make to every parent on this Zoom is what it takes to get into college is not a sustainable motivation. Even for the kids who've always hoped they're going to go to Caltech or Harvard, what motivates them innately is that they want to grow and develop.
And one of the things that we have learned working with students, and I think it goes a little bit back to what Bob just said, which I do think motivation right now is a little challenging for some of our students. Therefore, without a plan, without maybe an adult or a mentor or someone or a parent can easily do this, to help them kind of think it through. I think some of them haven't yet developed persistence to actually see something through without someone kind of helping them think through how I might try to do this. And then what do I do if it goes awry, And so one of the things that we actually, a few years ago when we were at South by Southwest, we had the pleasure of being at a Designing Your Life was a book that was really big about 4 years ago. And we had the pleasure of going to one of their workshops and we instantly thought you could use this with kids. And so we adapted it. And it's about, how much energy does it take? How difficult is it? And what resources am I going to need? I can guarantee you most teenagers are not going to think those things through without some help. And yet that's also the reason that it fails a lot of times is they don't think about the resources, or they don't think, oh, this is going to be kind of hard. Like I'm gonna have to dig in. So any ways that we can help students in their planning is really important in order for them to begin to get solid engagement. Now, let's be honest, some kids, this is easier for than others. And, we do this all day, every day. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we are able to get every single student to just say, oh, yes, I want to do this. And so what are some things to do when they're stuck? Start where they are. Start simple. Let them have a success that's simple, that is something that excites them. Brainstorm with the student outlets for their exploration, and then help them connect to resources. I would say one of the things that I've noticed over the last 15 years of working with kids is that they're less confident about reaching out and asking someone for something. So they need help walking through that, or writing the email, or making the phone call, those kinds of things. So I think adults in the lives of kids can help by connecting them with resources. And I think that is a really great place where parents are able to really help the student get energized. Many of our students do informational interviews around careers, and we often notice that at the beginning they really don't want to do this. And I would say 90 something percent of them really like it. That doesn't mean they wanted to do that career, but they really enjoyed it because they loved meeting the person and the funny things they said. And did you know they got to college, they were actually going to be a, you know, go to space, and now they're, a social worker or whatever. Like the stories, they tend to like it, and they tend to come back and report a lot. But the connection is hard, so helping them get connected, I think, is really important. Celebrating with them when they do try something new, because I think that is hard for kids. And finally, something that I am really a fan of and don't think we do enough of, is actually doing things as a family, especially as younger kids. There is no rule written anywhere that kids can't do something with a parent or as a family, like volunteering. For example, I'll use the same informational interview that we have kids do for careers. Is some of them I know are very shy. So I asked them from the beginning, are you going to be comfortable? No. Would you be comfortable if one of your parents went with you and y'all had coffee with this person? Yes. Now, we all know we're trying to launch them to college, so they've got to get here. But we're talking about a long arc of time from 8th grade to 12th grade, and we have to start where kids are again. So I think doing things as a family, it can be a really great way to start, especially for a student who's very reluctant, maybe a student who doesn't have a lot of social confidence, because we definitely see that in some of the kids, that there is no ding if you guys decide to take off on something as a family. I will put a little asterisk by it. We are talking about the slides before, things that actually interest the student. So it's not the idea, oh, we're going to do something, we're going to drag Johnny along to, mechanical engineering day, even though Johnny has no interest in mechanical engineering. It's got to actually fit their interest set for it probably to work that way. And there's certainly kids that wouldn't work with, but I think it actually works with more than people think it would. Now, there are a fair amount of kind of myths rolling around out there about engagement, especially as it relates to college, right? So I just want to kind of address those because, your students are at college going age, and all of these things that we're talking about are going to make students better able to thrive in college, and it will make them better college applicants. That's just not the first level reason to do it. But it will. The first thing is that every student should join a whole bunch of clubs at school. Many of our most successful college applicants do very little at school. So they may do research outside, they may have volunteering, they may be involved in the city environmental club. There are all sorts of ways that students get involved that have nothing to do with school clubs. And school clubs nowadays, most of them are so little time. School clubs are fantastic. If go back to the slides back here, if they actually interest the student, they're awesome, great. But they're not going to move the dial a lot in college admissions, and for some reason there's still that big belief out there that it will. That my student has to have one passion. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of passions. There's lots of things I love to do, and that is how most people are. So your student probably is going to have multiple things that they like and love, and that's great, so they can explore all of those things. The one that just drives me crazy and will not seem to die is that you really need this massive number of community service hours, or you're never going to get in college or be a successful human. And it's crazy. This really, especially in terms of college admissions, is not going to be the critical factor. What is way more critical is that your student genuinely cares about something in the community and wants to make it better. That's good for your student. That's good for the community. And yes, that actually does have legs when you get to the college admissions process, and it has legs beyond, because that means your student will probably be a person who stays involved in their community over time and makes the world a better place. And we all would like that. So this massive run for hours is sadly, and some kids, they just get so into it, and yet there's very little behind it on what I actually want to impact. So it also, if we're trying to teach volunteerism, I think one of the ways to do that is to, again, you could do this as a family. I know there are families that do many, community service projects with their religious institutions or on their own. But try to hone in on a few things and not just it be a smorgasbord of, oh, I cleaned up the trash at prom, I got a bunch of community service hours. I think this has become a little misguided. The last one is that extracurriculars and academics don't overlap. They absolutely can. There are some students who are incredibly academically and intellectually motivated, and that is kind of the thing they like to do in school and the thing they like to do out of school. And they probably don't want to join the student council or maybe the school newspaper, but they really would like to continue that academic interest. There's so many wonderful ways to do that. And the virtual world has opened up many, many additional ways to do that. There's research programs, there's tons of abilities to do this. And that is actually healthy. And there's nothing wrong with that. So students don't have to have, this is social, this is academic. Those things can overlap and usually are going to overlap some. And that's going to differ a lot between what your student is like socially and how they like to connect with people and what they like to connect on. There's so many different types of activities that students can engage in, right? Some of them we think of kind of the traditional summer courses, pre-college things. There's group projects that students will do together. I've seen groups of students who were all in a Spanish class decide they were going to go tutor in Spanish at a local organization. I've seen students on their own do an independent research project that they were excited about, wanted to learn more about. There's online classes, there's advocacy. We've seen a lot of kids getting deeply involved in advocacy around the environment. There's hobby projects, right? Like making a portfolio in one of the arts. I've students, whether it's photography, music, film. I've seen some amazing films that kids did, brought together their friends and made films. I have a student right now doing that on a critical social issue. It's quite compelling, something that they did on their own. There's community service, which we talked about. There's jobs. We forget about jobs. I think in our generation, kids worked a lot. And now with, all the things that kids do, jobs are not as popular, but we see kids learning so much from jobs. And there's so many of the things that are mentioned in that study, because in jobs, kids develop new skills. Even if it's a job that feels very mundane, they've got to learn to arrive on time. They've got to learn how to treat a customer. They've got to learn how to work with the boss. There's a lot of skills involved in jobs. And on the other side of college, we also see kids struggle in how to get jobs. So I think summer jobs can be a wonderful way to develop new skills and have engagement. And then internships, an internship in the modern world is internship with like little quotes around it. It's going to a job site, hopefully being of some use, and seeing what people do. Now, depending on a student's technical skills, sometimes they are able to do more, but in the younger years, even job shadowing, where students go and see the world of work, they get so excited about it. It's one of the things that they'll often come back and tell funny stories about or whatever. These kind of things and that's why one of the things I found so interesting about this study, it connects for me, meeting with kids all the time is that they actually want to feel hopeful about jobs. So exposure to jobs for most of them. I had a young woman who worked in a real estate office and she just got into it so much, like if the house sold and how many days and all of that. So all those kind of things are wonderful. Obviously, travel can be very eye-opening for students and expose them to new cultures, caring for others, and the list goes on and on. You know, all types of activities that I think the key is, going back to the student and seeing what is it that they are interested in. Bob, do you want to add anything here?
No, no, and not at all. I mean, one of the things that we have tried to draw out here is some of the examples of engaged students that don't fit that sort of classic definition of president of this, of a student whose robotics team won this. And those are all important. We don't want to minimize those. But there is this sense of sort of achievement envy. And one of the things that the Gallup study speaks to so clearly is that desire for hope and that sense of someone else seeing them for who they are and their talents. And so we won't go item by item here, but there are so many great examples of a student who on Instagram started focusing on the clothes that she designed on that kid who was just a car fanatic, and that's how he learned that he loves mechanical engineering, of that science enthusiast who built labs for middle schoolers. There are just so many great examples, and each of these are so specific to a student. They're not one size fits all. There's not an emphasis on, oh, well, you like engineering, you're this kid. It really comes inside out in terms of some of the examples of what an active student might look like. Lisa, we've created a couple of examples here. Do you want to take the folks on the webinar these just to give them a sense?
Absolutely. I have to go to one that was on that other slide because I had thought of it recently, which was this kid who went and made history videos. And so he was really fascinated with American history. So his family went all around to American history sites around the country, and he would do, and then they would video him and he would do these videos and then he'd put them up and he got like a lot of followers. And this was a very introverted kid, but he loved his history so much that he loved doing these, and he was not a joiner at all. And he was a very competitive college applicant in the end, but it's like that. Like, I don't know anybody else that would have done that exact thing. It just was so him. So that's kind of the trick. This one is a student that I actually worked with, and she worked at the ice cream shop. Kind of didn't love it, honestly, but kept working there because she committed to her parents that she was going to work. And she became the expert ice cream scooper and dishwasher starting in the 8th grade. And so that was how she started. Later on, we'll tell you more. Another student that we worked with loved science, and she loved visiting science museums. And in the 9th grade, she started volunteering at a local hospital. Both of these seem very simple. This is what they did. And later we'll share with you how this evolved. One of the things that College Match Point, we sort of started doing during COVID I don't know why we started doing it, you guys, but we did. We started a page on our website of summer engagement opportunities, which has really grown and grown and grown. And so we do on College Match Point, we have opportunities that are predominantly summer. There are some that are year round. So if you're looking for courses or research or service, there are some of these that go year round, and that is on the college website, on the College Match Point website. And it is something that we will continue to do just as a community service, because now we've just gotten into it, and it's fun, and it also helps us have those things for our students, but you're welcome to use that resource.
So one of the things that parents oftentimes ask, sometimes parents in 8th or 9th grade will ask this, is how do colleges actually evaluate a student's activities? Now, we've developed this model because we feel like the starting point for all students should be academic rigor. And that doesn't mean that they all take AP classes. It doesn't mean that they're all in IB programs. What it means is that they look at the courses that their high school offers and they choose the places where their aptitudes, where their skills will flourish in the classroom. Outside of the classroom, there are three areas that we encourage families and students to consider when they're thinking about where to get engaged. The first one is fit to major. And this isn't just because colleges care about it, and many do. It's because students really are focused on a hope for their career, what they'll do, not just in college, but out of college. The next one is common good. And this is a contrast to what Lisa pointed out to in terms of amassing hundreds of hours on service hours, as opposed to caring about an issue so much that you want to impact the world. And then finally, building on the example that Lisa shared of that student who did history videos, just the innate curiosity that a student has. Now, we've also noticed in a great way that those skills that students want to develop, colleges look for them now. Colleges want to evaluate that a student has great communication skills, that they've developed resilience. And trust me, when they get to the essay writing process in summer before senior year, there'll be so many places where they can communicate those skills they developed by being engaged during high school.
And
Now,
I would
in
add there, one thing I would add on that previous slide is that if you look at those words that colleges are looking for, they're very similar to some of the things that we saw in the Gallup research, because colleges are also noticing where students are right now. So I think that's interesting that there's a fair amount of parallel between those two things.
in addition to a focus on skills, one thing that we've noticed through the pandemic, and it's now persisted coming out of this, at least initial phase of the pandemic, is how much colleges are looking for students who've taken initiative and had impact in the communities that they've been a part of. Now, this may take a little more creativity and planning. And as Lisa said, it may be an opportunity to work as a family. But we do want to say to students, look, you're a member of so many communities. It may be as a Girl Scout, it may be a faith community, it might be at your neighborhood. And there is a sense to respond to either immediate or ongoing needs in the communities that you're a part of. Now, we want to piggyback on the examples that Lisa showed and explain to you tangible examples. Jenny, that kid who loved ice cream and became the expert scooper, well, she was actually promoted to be a citywide ice cream merchandiser. They took her love of ice cream and they said, could you go to the local grocery stores and help pitch our pints of ice cream? That helped her understand I'm a marketing kid. Yeah, it's not just about ice cream. It's about how much I love taking my aptitudes and my skills at communication and my enthusiasm and translating that to a major. Now, Smita, that example of of um, that started in the hospital greeting patients. Well, she attended a summer medical program. She connected to kids all over the world who shared her interest, and as a basis of that, she found an internship where she could connect her real interest in impacting the world to an internship where she actually was able to see what a doctor does, and it motivated her to get even more involved. Now, Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about what the more selective colleges and the more selective majors think about in terms of student engagement?
Absolutely. And of course, we'll have a whole webinar on this, but we know that there's some people who really want to make sure we address this. So we thought we would today as well. One of the things, if a student is aiming for the most selective schools in the country, which now those are there's getting to be more and more of those with, say admissions rates under 20%, you want to be thinking ultimately, not starting in the eighth and ninth grade, but ultimately that you should be doing engagement at the regional, state, or national level, and that you are committed to solving problems. And for example, if you're doing something in your school or your neighborhood or your community, that you're doing a one-time thing and it ends, but you're actually leaving a legacy so that this continues on after you. And it's very interesting. This group of students right now are hesitant to want to get other students involved in things, but it's really hard to leave a legacy without doing things with other people. And colleges very much want to see that you can work with other people. So I think that is also important. For STEM students, especially, colleges are wanting to see multi-year engagement in STEM work, and that where a student has got some type of portfolio, research, and I would say we're seeing business students also becoming much more competitive and wanting to see multi-year engagement as well. For certain majors, I think independent research has also become, very popular. I think some things are called research, which maybe aren't research, but I think anytime a student demonstrates that they're intellectually curious enough to go beyond, their schoolwork outside of the classroom, but that has to resonate with your students. I now see some students where it's clear that the student has no jazz for this, and they're that won't work, because this is something that the student has to be motivated before. But I can say for other students, this is like they just delight in it, they love it, and it's like they'd like to do this all the time and not go to school. So these are just a few of the things. There's certainly, we could go on for a whole webinar on this, but just a little bit around engagement and what highly selective colleges and majors are looking for. And we are seeing more highly selective majors, and I think that will likely continue.
I want to piggyback on that with one comment. We see students who ultimately launch into a college that is more selective. The consistent driver there is that the student drove their engagement. That it wasn't Google Maps. Some person gave them some mythical map of you need to do this and this and this to end up at Rice or Pitzer or Harvard. And it certainly can't be Uber. That some adult, it might be their school counselor, it might be mom or dad, it might be us and the students that we work with, somehow that you drove them to these activities. That motivation, as Gallup pointed out, has to come inside out. And we have seen over the last 15 years that has to be driven by the students' aptitudes, by the skills they want to develop, and what motivates them intrinsically. Lisa, could you talk for a couple of minutes about what UT actually looks at?
First, I'm going to answer a question we had, because I think it's an important question that probably others have too. And the question was, what if my student is really involved in sports, but they don't really have time to do much else? And my answer is, like a lot of things, it depends. So I would say, how much does the student actually love sports? How much is it feeding the student and giving them? And what are the students' goals for the future, right? And how can they juggle that? There are certainly students who are varsity athletes who go on to every range of colleges possible, but it does make it more difficult. So I think figuring out how a student really, what is their priorities, both what are their priorities for college and what are their priorities for their activities, you've got to kind of find the balance there. Yeah, because I think that sports actually for some students is so critical to their social circle, to their identity, to their health, to their mental health. So I don't think that we should start saying, oh, don't do sports because it's not as good as doing research or something like that. Again, I think it has to come back to the student. But I also think you've got to look at the student's goals and say, okay, how would I be able to also weave in other things, and what would that look like? So we were going to talk just a little bit today because we know that there are many people who look to us for guidance on UT. And so we thought that as long as we're talking about engagement, and UT engagement is critically important at UT, that we would take this opportunity. We put a graphic here. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time going through the graphic of how UT evaluates, except to say that UT uses what's called an expanded resume, which really should be called an expanded list, inventory of engagement, which oftentimes is pretty long. And that is a critical part of actually getting into the university. So if your student in younger years is UT or bust, engagement is going to be a critical part of their high school in order for them to be competitive.
One of the minor observations here is during the pandemic, UT made the test score submission optional. The expanded resume continues to be core because they know fit to major and they know student engagement is important, and trust us, from our 15 years of experience of working with students who apply to UT, they read the expanded resume.
In addition, of course, UT is, like every college, is asking for reflection. College essays are predominantly how well can a student reflect? And this ties back to engagement. A student needs to have experiences to engage on. And parents, if there is one thing you could do to help your students in the 9th grade and the 10th grade to ultimately be ready to apply to whatever college they decide to apply to, it's to have one night a week, a month, or sometime when you reflect on what did you get out of that? What did you learn about yourself? How did that make you different? How was this experience different? The reflection muscles in students it needs development, and this is something you can do at home, and actually really help your students. So for UT, they're going to again be hitting on engagement in these essays. Your first choice major, you really want to have that backed up with some engagement. Your leadership activities you want to have, and leadership can be very traditional or not traditional, like things at home, but the supplemental questions for UT very much tied to engagement. And then ultimately, as I said, all students are going to have an expanded resume. It starts at the summer before 9th grade going forward. And for this, it is heavily focused on how the student fits to the major they're applying into UT. And that is a very critical thing. And if you're interested in that, we have UT webinars that you can watch, but it does become critical for students who are UT or bust to make sure, in addition to over the arc of high school, to make sure that they're definitely doing some career exploration activities as well. And then fit to major in more competitive majors at UT is kind of what we said earlier, which is that you're going to need more, more entries, right? Like you're going to need to have started it younger or done more things. We often say, we like to see 3 beats on a major at least. Now, one person's 1 beat could be another person's 3 beats, right? Depending on what they do. But and when by beats, I mean courses outside of school, internships, summer programs, research, all those things, especially in highly competitive majors. And then role of a parent in this process, I think, is, one of the things we've been talking about all along. Bob, do you want to take this?
Yeah. As a parent, and we're lucky, we get to work with so many parents. We see so many of them having just an innate commitment, their own sense of parenting values related to this growth mindset, to this sense of helping their students stretch. The Gallup research talks about that students actually are hungry to be challenged. Now, that may be easy to say, on that day that they fail or need help. It may be a difficult day, but we encourage parents to really lean into a growth mindset as opposed to always using this litmus test of quote unquote, what will look good to a college. Now, in terms of nurturing that engagement, as Lisa said before, listening to what your student is interested in is so powerful. It just makes such a difference. Helping them connect to resources. There are few, if any, students in high school who got an internship on their own. It always comes from friends of mom or dad. Same with informational interviews. I think we've stressed this several times, but if there's anything you take away from this webinar, really think about how your family's values and how your family spends time together, how that can help spur engagement. And then, as Lisa said, reflection is just a healthy muscle set. It certainly will be important in the college process, but even more important, it helps a student really be prepared to thrive. We sure have appreciated being with all of you this evening. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask us in the follow-up email that we'll send with the recording of this webinar. We hope you have a great evening, and we hope that your September ends strong. Thanks so much, everybody.